Thank you. This is on. Yeah. Okay. So good morning. I hope to keep you awake early in the morning. It's always interesting to, as a professional historian, to talk in front of some of my historical actors, like one of the key ones sitting right here in the front, and Glenn is my follow-up, because a good friend of mine, a colleague, Robert Smith, the historian of the Hubble Space Telescope, said he prefers to write about the 19th century because the historical actors are dead and can't complain about what you say about them. And I certainly experienced that when I wrote about von Braun, Peenemünde, and V2, and the Huntsville Germans were not happy with me. But it seems like from what I published on this that the historical actors involved in this pretty much agree with me, or at least they don't find my historian's take on it objectionable. So I wanted to start briefly. I don't think I'm going to spend a lot of time on this. I mean, you've already done the scientific review. I saw Kevin Schindler's talk the other day. I think the key point here is that Pluto science actually became interesting and it's even exciting between the late 1970s and the 1980s. It became a topic of scientific interest. Previously, as noted, this somewhat tongue-in-cheek paper that Dessler and Russell published in 1980, the mass estimates of Pluto were declining on a curve that would officially mean it would disappear. They jokingly said that it was, and not a whole lot was known about it other than the rotation period, the obliquity, the early detection of methane ice. And the orbit, and not a whole lot else. But then the discovery of Charon resulted in a considerable improvement in our understanding of the mass and all these things, as you understand as well or better than I do. The result was that it was becoming a scientifically important topic, and it was something that potentially could be explored. But of course, the question was, how do we do that since this was not a NASA priority? As I said in the summary slide, there's a long and painful birth. Not all of that unusual in the history of the planetary program. So I more recently published an article on the history of Europa Clipper's parallel, extremely long and tortured birth. But it took 14 years. It was at JPL. It was a JPL project until 2001. And I am talking about that whole history, not just narrowly about New Horizons itself as it emerged after the year 2000. As I mentioned here, sort of my message in terms of the history of space policy, which is what I mostly write about when I've been writing about planetary exploration, is that you see really two different eras around the change around the year 2000. Up to that time, you see a NASA that's largely in control of space, what planetary exploration should be done, what missions should be presented. Obviously, Congress always had a say in, objecting or approving funding or not funding, but fundamentally NASA determined what kind of missions it wanted to have, what was important, and there was not so much outside interference in terms of what, or external intervention, I'd be a better way to put it, into what NASA's planetary exploration policy would be. But you find around 2000, and the Pluto is a very interesting example of this test case, you find after the year 2000, in part because of, or in large part because of the Discovery program, that there's a new era of new players, notably APL becomes important at this point in time. That produces new external intervention, notably by this Maryland Senator Mikulski and others, to change the way that planetary exploration decision-making is made. Now, of course, there's a long prehistory to this. There's been discussions of going to Pluto, going back to the Grand Tour in the 1960s, 70s. And the net effect of that, of course, as is well known, is that Voyager ended up doing the 4 giant planets and not going to Pluto. And part of it was that the ambitions of the Grand Tour from the 1970s did not match the post-Apollo moment in which money was tight. And so it was cut back to Mariner, Jupiter, Saturn, later titled Voyager. but the trajectories were possible. There was a possible trajectory from Jupiter and Saturn to Pluto, but the higher priority for Voyager 1 was a successful flyby of Titan, which at that point was a lot easier to get to because it was, going to Saturn. It was also a higher scientific priority target, and as I mentioned, Pluto was a little sort of in that time frame, little known, and little known was known about it. So any possibility of going to Pluto disappeared, particularly with the trajectory choice for Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, and meaning that the last outer planets mission at that point was Voyager 2 passing by Neptune in 1989. Now, speaking about my historical actors in the room, of course, around 1989, you have this attempts to get this on the agenda, notably by Alan and then Fran Bagenal and others about getting a mission on the agenda. And Alan went and talked to Jeff Briggs, who was then the head of planetary, it was called Solar System Exploration Division at that point, in May of 1989. Actually, as I recall, on the day they watched the launch of Magellan to Venus on the shuttle in that morning on TV, and then talked about this idea. There was a lot of disgruntlement in the scientific community circa 1989 about the state of the planetary program. Contrary to some impressions, in fact, the money was pretty good at that point. The head of the associate administrator at that point, whose name is escaping me at this very second, but had secured a deal of 20% of the NASA budget be devoted to the space science budget, as a result of the money put into the shuttle replacement after the Challenger accident. There was money for the planetary exploration program, but it was concentrated in a few giant programs. And this was the way NASA had come to deal with the planetary business, and the way JPL operated effectively was it wanted one giant program like Voyager, like Viking, like Voyager, then Galileo and Magellan after another. And those few opportunities to go to the planets were loaded up and often were very, very, very expensive. And like someone said, the last bus out of town, everybody wanted to get their instruments on it. And the result was there was a lack of opportunity. And particularly notable here was the Tom Cremigis's advocacy for a new small exploration program, which became the Discovery program. He was pressing in 1989, as well as Alan was looking for a chance to have a Pluto mission. Of course, there's the famous dinner at Italian in Little Italy in Baltimore after the AGU meeting in May 1989, in which Alan and Fran and others talked about how do we build the advocacy inside the community in order to have a Pluto mission. Bob Farquhar was brought in to help with the Discovery program. He at that point was still at Goddard, and he also was tasked with helping create a Pluto study, since Jeff Briggs heard from the community, thanks to this advocacy, of the strong interest in having some kind of Pluto mission, notably with Neptune going to be encountered at the end of August, but nothing beyond it in terms of nothing beyond it except the promise of what became Galileo at that point. Now, at this point in time, the study that was created was Pluto 350. This is a line diagram here of Pluto 350. It was a study done between 1989 and 1990, a 350 kilogram dry mass Pluto mission. It was smaller. It was half the size of a Voyager, but it seemed feasible. Farquhar said we could do that by going through using a Delta II and a series of encounters in the inner solar system before going to Jupiter, because one of the problems you see throughout these proposals in the 90s is that the next opportunity for a direct launch to Jupiter as Jupiter gravity system Pluto would have been in the early 2000s. So if you wanted to launch sooner than the early 2000s, you were going to have to go either direct, which is extremely difficult, or you were going to have to wait until the year 2000 and maybe use intersolar system gravity assist to get to Jupiter in that time frame. The problem with this proposal is in many ways it fell between the stools. It turned out to be a bit too big for a discovery mission, which at that point, NASA wanted to focus on something on the inner solar system, easier to do with. Earliest idea became near. And then into the middle of this thing, Mars became a project that came 1997's landing. The Huntress became, Wes Huntress in the lower right here, became the director of the planetary division in 1990, replacing Jeff Briggs. He definitely thought of Pluto as one of his important objectives, another being getting the discovery program started. But at that point in time, JPL was very oriented towards selling Mariner Mark II, which became only Cassini, and selling a line of giant Voyager class or bigger than Voyager class spacecraft on the Mariner Mark II. Officially on the agenda, there was Cassini as well as Craft, Comet Rendezvous, and Asteroid Flyby. And there was a hope there'd be more Mariner Mark IIs. And so JPL started studying a Pluto mission based on this much bigger spacecraft. But that all hit basically a period of budget problems, of budget uncertainty and difficulty in the early 1990s. It was the end of the Cold War. Some of the energy or political will to spend more money on the space program was declining. There was the Hubble Mir embarrassment of 1990, and the NASA budget was going to be shrinking or flatlining at best in the early 1990s. And that became even truer when after the Clinton election in 1992. There was not an interest in throwing more money at the program, and Huntress had to reconsider what was feasible. And Mariner Mark II got cut back to only Cassini, and the question is what to do about trying to get Discovery on the road and getting and maybe a Pluto mission if possible. Now, sort of at this point in time, of course, Dan Golden became the administrator on April 1st, 1992, and was brought in at the end of, or what turned out to be the end of the George H.W. Bush administration to shake up the program, which was viewed as bureaucratic and expensive and inefficient, notably in the wake of the Hubble Mir fiasco. And the idea was to inject the kind of innovation that had taken place in SDI into the NASA program and into the NASA planetary program. Quite sort of independently of all that, there was an independent birth of a Pluto mission idea, and that was, of course, Rob Staley went to this ceremony at JPL for issuance of a stamp set of each of the stamps of all the planets and who that had been explored. And the Pluto stamp, as you see, came out not yet explored. And Rob took that as a personal challenge, and he took the interest. He ran into a friend, Stacy Weinstein here in the lower, in that picture on the lower right. And they started talking about what could you do with an absolute minimal mission? Could you launch a spacecraft that would be 35 kilograms and go to Pluto, and what would it do? And of course, the problem was that it would do very little because you would have very little weight allowance for instruments. But they came up with this idea of having a very, very large rocket like a Titan IV Centaur launch a very, very tiny spacecraft, or maybe two of them as a backup, and launch that to Pluto, and they called that Pluto Fast Flyby, using a direct launch in the 1990s. And that was just an idea out there. They seem to have been completely not knowledgeable about the other side of Pluto advocacy by Allen and others in the early 1990s. And it happened that Golden was speaking at a ceremony, or as Golden would be at a ceremony at the Academy of Motion Picture Sciences in Hollywood in spring of 1992 to give back an Oscar that had been used on the space shuttle during this Oscar ceremony earlier in the year. And Staley stood in the receiving line and essentially talked to him and said, hey, you know, we've got this idea. And Griffin seized upon that. He asked him if he could take the whole package with him. And he became very excited about this idea of getting to Pluto in a big hurry. In fact, even before that event, he had met Huntress for the first time, I think in April, and said, you know, how can you get me a mission to Pluto for $100 million and bring a sample back, which Huntress said was absurd, but he couldn't say that if he wanted to keep his job. So at any rate, Golan was definitely interested in this idea, but there was a big problem, and that was the expense of a large vehicle like Titan IV Centaur, which would be the largest vehicle that could launch such a fast flyby mission, or the only vehicle maybe that, at that point in time, who could launch such a fast flyby mission. So, you know, I mean, certainly in the Outer Planet Science Working Group, which had been formed around the Pluto mission and around this discussion of what to do next, there was disgruntlement with this intervention of fast flyby. I know from effectively the memoir that Alan published with David Grinspoon, that it just seems like an arbitrary thing that screwed up. Going back to Pluto 350, I think probably Pluto 350, it was really up against it between being too big for a discovery mission and too big and or at least too expensive for a discovery mission, and at a time when the budget was going backwards and not forwards. And so in early 1994, Alan went to Moscow, and then NASA tried to stop him on the way to go talk to the Russians about the possibility of Russians launching a version of Pluto fast flyby. The net effect of that discussion with Alex Galeev was that, you know, the Russians would get interested if they had some piece of it, a drop sonde to an impactor on Pluto. That seemed like an interesting idea. At this point in time, this took off because it was in the context of the whole origins of ISS, or the origins of the combined program as ISS. Because in the fall of '93, Gore had met Prime Minister Chernomyrdin. They talked about an ISS agreement that led to the actual agreement in 1994. There was a moment of hope that that Russia would become oriented to the West. It all seems very quaint at this point, given the current politics of the situation. But the net result was that there was a serious discussions and meetings between 1994 and 1996 of what was called the fire and ice missions. That would actually combine Pluto with solar probe and have, because the idea at that point was to send solar probe around Jupiter to use it to come to lower the perihelion close to the sun. But it all came to naught. You know, there was an attempt to get the Germans maybe to pay for it because the Russians backed out of paying for a Proton, and then they backed out of Proton entirely and wanted to use a Molniya vehicle. And they run up against basically both the lack of money in the Russian program and the decline of the competence and ability of the Russian planetary program, which led to a fiasco when Mars 96 was launched in 1996 and didn't even get out of orbit. At the same time, in parallel to this, Golden was forcing multiple studies on the team, on the Pluto team, now combined with JPL and Alan on the head of the science team, to study and study and study, which became extraordinarily frustrating. And you see here, it was renamed Pluto Express in 1994, and you see here a comparison of Cassini to what was in a very, very small spacecraft that could be launched, presumably at this point now after 2001, using a Jupiter gravity assist. But you know, there are a lot of explanations for why Golden did that. Is it because he just didn't think there was the money and he was essentially forcing the team to study and restudy and restudy. That was certainly Alan's point of view. Wes Huntress told me that he thought fundamentally it was a lack of money. I mean, among other problems that came up was that Mars Observer blew up in August 1993 before it entered Mars orbit. So there was a scandal over the failure of that program. There was a general tightness of the money. And when Golden seemed enthused about going to Pluto in the early in his period as administrator, he now no longer seemed that committed to it. And there was this cartoon was the Lucy and the football cartoon was used because of the sense of every time the team produced something, NASA would say, go back and redo it all over again. Well, there was an interesting change happened in 1996, and that was a combination of the so-called Mars rock. There was this great reveal at headquarters in August 1996 of the Mars rock that was supposed to contain tiny, tiny fossils, possibly of Martian life. Quickly just debunked, I guess, or no, not debunked, but quickly lost scientific favor. But at the time, it contributed to political will in the Clinton administration, Congress, to spend more money. Simultaneously, Galileo went into orbit around Jupiter at the end of 1995, and it produced pictures of Europa, which were exciting. So there was this whole push, basically, as always. Extraterrestrial life is extremely motivating to the general public and the politicians in terms of spending money. And so there was a window there that Wes Huntress could use and Golden could use to increase the planetary budget a bit in the late 1990s. And that led to the creation of a program that often is written out of history because no one remembers it, Outer Planet Solar Probe in 1997-98. It was actually a new start called Outer Planet Solar Probe. It would combine Pluto, Europa, and Solar Probe, all of which, of course, now are separate missions. Essentially, Europa Clipper, New Horizons, and Parker Solar Probe all had the same origin at that point, intertwined with each other, all in the argument that they would have to go to Jupiter on their way. And so there was this design for a new spacecraft. This is one of the late drawings from, I think, 1999, showing a Europa orbiter and a version of a similar spacecraft, smaller and with less radiation shielding, that would become Pluto Kuiper Express at that point, and now the name changed to emphasize with the discovery of Albion and KBOs. There was some now scientific excitement around the idea of a Kuiper Belt mission. And it was all supposed to be wrapped up in this whole package. There was even a science definition teams launched for the Europa orbiter and PKE. And there was a decision in 2000 about scientific packages that was never announced because the whole project ran into a brick wall. And by 2000, Outer Planet Solar Probe was in crisis because of big increases in the budget. We see here something Ed Weiler, who became for the first time associate administrator in 1998 after Hunter's feeling burned out had left for Carnegie Institution of Washington. And that led to the sense of this project is out of control cost-wise, that it had more than doubled in price, and that was only the projection as of 2000. Solar Probe at that point had been suddenly pushed off to the margins. It was a heliophysics mission, and I get the impression that maybe JPL was not terribly interested in it. And that led to, there's actually a typo, it should be September the 12th, 2000, Weiler canceled PKE. He issued a stop work order. Rob Staley certainly remembers it coming in on the teletype and being shown that. It was a sickening feeling. He said, Pluto is killed. Europa has political priority. Europa is what people are excited about in the administration and in the public, and we're killing Pluto. That produced essentially a rebellion or a campaign to save Pluto. Of course, that actually started before that cancellation event because the warning signs were already there. Weiler had already given signals about this. And so with Planetary Society, with the student called Ted Nichols and others. There was a public campaign to save Pluto. Weiler says it didn't really have any effect on his decision. I'm not clear to me how much the public effect was. It's hard to measure. But one of the clear answers on this was that one of the clear factors was that essentially a rebellion in the scientific community over this decision that took place, and particularly was enacted at what was the DPS meeting in Pasadena, followed by immediately by the meeting of the Solar System Exploration Committee. And Weiler got the message there and he had that message already before, he's told me in an interview, that the scientific community wanted to go to Pluto. The arguments, particularly at that point, the scientific argument was that number one, there was prediction of a possible atmospheric collapse that would happen in the 2010s or by 2020. And therefore, maybe there wouldn't be an atmosphere to observe if you waited too long as Pluto turned in its orbit, and then the southern hemisphere became more and more in darkness. And the longer you waited, the less of Pluto you were going to see. Europa would always be there, but could be, you could reach it on any launch attempt, but it was very expensive because of the radiation hardening problem. And so the net result was that Weiler, in fact, raised with Tom Kermegis already in the middle of October. He mentioned it in his call to the SSES in the end on Halloween 2000, that there might be a competition. And he actually went to Tom Kermegis and in November of 2000 and said, could APL produce a mission for $500 million, minus not counting the booster cost? Could it be possible to build a spacecraft? APL had this credibility now that NEAR had reached Eros, was orbiting Eros. Of course, it would eventually have an unscheduled landing on Eros in 2001. APL had a lot of credibility now. And so the net result was that APL did produce such a study, a rush study. And that led to, the Weiler is not viewed favorably by people in this community. I think for this reason, he actually was the one who pushed the idea of an announcement of opportunity to create this possible competition for a Pluto program based on the model of the Discovery program that would take place in 2001. And they actually released this announcement of opportunity, and with this preliminary on December 20th and a final on January 19th, which just happened to be the last full day of the Clinton administration. And that came out and immediately came out. And then the Bush administration came into office and said, Pluto overran all its budgets, which didn't apply to the current program, and we're canceling the AO. And so the AO was canceled, but Barbara Mikulski said, okay, so you intervened at that point and said, you will have a competition, told NASA as the head of the appropriations subcommittee that controlled NASA budget, you will have a competition. The AO did happen. And of course, out of that came the 5 applications, one of which was New Horizons, 2 of which came from JPL, which were down selected to New Horizons and a JPL proposal called Posse. Now, that then went on as a consideration through 2001. And I see I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to rush it a little bit. But you see in this whole thing, the real change in how planetary policy worked. Part of it was the Discovery program. Part of it was the rise of APL, the ability of Mikulski to intervene personally to save APL projects. And you see a different environment that takes place in this immediate aftermath. Stern and, in November 2001, Alan received a call about the approval of New Horizons as the victory, or the New Horizons, but the letter that came a week later had a long string of conditions and made it look extremely difficult to carry out this mission with a fixed budget, a nuclear launch, and all of the other demands on time. And just to sort of abbreviate this, and Glenn will talk more about what actually happened in the team, the net result was that there would be a decadal survey. The administration canceled again at the beginning of 2002. Mikulski again said the money will be there for one more, in this case, phase B, but after that, you need approval. Weiler said you need the approval of the first planetary decadal survey, and the net result was yes, that was done. The planetary the Kuiper Belt mission, as it was framed in that decadal, was #1 on the medium missions list, and that allowed politically NASA to go forward. At the same time, that was the creation of the New Frontiers program. Had been a small budget line that Hartman and Weiler had put in the budget. It now became that New Horizons was relabeled as the first New Frontiers mission and would go forward, although there were more battles on the way in terms of Mikulski having to intervene again and again and again to make sure that it stayed on track. But that, at least with a political decision-making, as of the beginning of 2003, the Bush administration, second Bush administration, said, yes, you are an official program. There will be a New Horizons. So, as I mentioned here, there is a dogged advocacy was critical to this. A part of it was just the whole change in the way NASA operated and the way planetary exploration policy operated circa 2000. Obviously, the scientific case became much more interesting over time as this whole power shift resulted in, the fortunate survival of New Horizons through any Pluto mission, through all of these incredible difficulties, cancellations, and rebirths. Thank you very much.
Time for a few quick questions before the coffee break.
Hi, Paul Schenk. Back in 2000, of course, there was the double Mars catastrophe of the polar lander crashing and the climate orbiter crashing as well. Did that have any influence on the trajectory of the Pluto mission?
Yeah, I mean, it was on my slide, but I was starting to say, okay, I'm running a little long. I better zoom by that. Yeah, the Mars 99 failures obviously didn't directly help Pluto immediately by any means, but it was part of the space policy environment that was really important because it marked basically the end of faster, better, cheaper. That Golden had pushed faster, better, cheaper, and the Mars 99 failures were viewed as a demonstration that they'd gone too far, they'd cut too much, they were trying to do things on too small of budgets. And Golden also just politically became much more risk averse at that point, because of the firestorm over the Mars failures. So it played into this environment in 1999. I mean, I think in terms of its effect on what was then still the JPL Outer Planet Solar Program, it probably made the matters worse because the project manager, John McNamee, said, well, we have to be more conservative of our engineering. We have to, take less risk. And that meant weight gain, mass gain on the spacecraft. And of course, there was also the whole, as it was revealed in the kind of controversy of 2000, how the Pluto PKE had been loaded down with all of these things that were necessary for Europa. Even if they took the panels off the vault that was supposed to cover the electronics on Europa orbiter, PKE was just really on the heavy side. So yeah, it played politically important, obviously, the change in Golden's policy and how that played out over the other programs.
Thank you for the very interesting talk. I just have a small, I'll be short. In 1996, the world was also excited, enthused, and energized by the appearance of comets Hale-Bopp and Hyakutake. They were worldwide, and I think that also helped get the scientific momentum for looking at the solar system again. So I would add that to your story. Hale-Bopp
specifically?
Hale-Bopp is huge.
Yeah, I didn't see it coming up in anywhere in the story. Obviously, that the comments were exciting, but I didn't see that playing out in any policy impact.
Interesting.
Yeah, thanks.
Alan's passion for this mission, his ability to convince others to join him in that quest. How do you see that in the sweep of planetary mission history? Has there been another example of a single scientist who was that instrumental in the creation of a planetary mission?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know, probably not. I mean, certainly you see, and I've written about a Europa Clipper, and I'm happy to send the PDFs of these articles I've written to anyone who wants to send me an email. I think that, you see people in the Europa like Bob Pappalardo who stick with it through lots, but it's not quite the same level. And it speaks to the fact that there is this change. It's less of a product of a NASA bureaucracy. In the Cold War, the height of the Cold War, the early program, there was a, headquarters level decision. We will have, a ranger, a mariner, surveyor, and so on. We'll have these programs. They're not so much directed to a single mission, but we'll have these lines of missions that will happen. And then you get into as I said, into the post-Apollo period, you end up this shrinking down to one giant program, again, largely decided top down from headquarters or maybe through JPL advocacy about what was going to be done next. And it's not as personality driven, or at least not driven by the scientific community. Part of what Discovery does to the whole planetary mission environment is it creates this model of the PI as the person who will lead a mission team. The application of the PI model, which Huntress and others advocated, Tom Cruise and others advocated, because it had been used to some extent in small heliophysics missions that APL had been involved with and things like that. The PI model for running a mission was different than the old way of doing things. Yeah.
Michael, it's Bill McKinnon. Thank you very much for that wonderful business. I just want to, I've always been struck by and amazed by the fact that we, New Horizons proposal, actually won the final competition. And not that I'm complaining, but
yeah.
But the question, JPL has, had and still has so much political power. So my real question is, from a scientific history point of view, is there some rule like in 50 years, a historian like yourself can have access to the internal deliberations of NASA as to how these decisions were actually created?
Well, I mean, as an historian, one of the challenges of doing contemporary history, which I did when I was, so basically I worked on planetary exploration history for about 8-10 years, starting in 2013, is that you get into the era of the 1990s and later, and everything is done with email or phone calls, and there's a disappearing record. It's a challenge to write about. As a professional historians, we're trained to go to archives and look at paperwork, and a lot of the paperwork exists for NASA in earlier years and sort of disappears in the 90s. Part of it's a sort of collapse of archiving at NASA headquarters. And things like that. There are a lot of reasons why it's challenging. And I had to do a lot of oral histories, with a lot of the key players, Alan, Rob, and others, to fill in the blanks. The reason why I ended up writing about Pluto was because I found in Tom Cremige's paper, and Tom was still old school, collecting a lot of paper records, deposited in the APL archives was his file on the formation of the New Horizons team in 2000, 2001. So that was very interesting. So it's challenging. I guess maybe I missed the first part of your question. Or...
No, you answered it.
Yeah, it's challenging to do history now, particularly because everything is electronic, and often all you find are the PowerPoints. But you don't know what's behind the slides unless you talk to people or they can show you your email. But it's hard to get email out of out of institutions, because people use the email for all kinds of personal stuff, and there's also called PII, personal identifiable information, and so forth. And lawyers don't want to let the email. You just look at email in general, so it takes a real effort on archivists to try to get that stuff out and available. But yeah, I mean, maybe in 20 or 30 years, a little more will come out, but it's a different world for doing archival research than it used to be. I went back. I'm working on the history of the Smithsonian in the 20th century right now, and it's paper. There's lots of paper to look at, and that kind of goes away as you get into the 90s. Yeah, my friend.
Ram Bagnall, I just want to make a quick comment. I totally agree with your PI Pluto versus center-led Europa, and the difference that that leads to an individual, this case Alan, leading the charge and persisting with the charge and winning the PI-led. But I do want to point out that having been involved heavily with the OPAG way back in the 2000s, that Ron Greeley really was a very strong advocate of the Europa Clipper, and he pushed that forward. But of course, because it was center-led, it was not, his name was then removed from it, and it became.
Yeah, I didn't catch the name, partly because I forgot to put in my hearing aids when I rushed out of the house to be here.
Ron Greeley.
Yeah, Ron Greeley. Yeah, I know. I heard that. Yeah,
Yeah.
particularly Bob Papalardo talks about Ron Greeley's importance
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
in Europa.
Yep.
in
He
advance of
really
that.
was the big campaigner back in the 2000s for Europe.
Mhm.
I just want to give him.
Yeah, no, I mean, I sure if I had time or thought about it more, I may give a more complicated answer to that. But yeah, thank you. I guess we,
Quick question.
sure.
If you can go back to where you had just one more, there we go. Where you've got the fat PKE. What's F5?
Yeah, I mean, that was another thing I probably I would have talked about if I had a little more time. But that was the last version, essentially in 2000, an attempt to try to save money and save this outer planet solar probe project. There was a last attempt to do a PKE, and that was a draft of something that was actually, as you can see from the weight, a lot more, maybe more in the ballpark of what might be launched. Because if you go back even farther to the diagram that you see here, and this, I probably 1999 diagram, it has this notation. These boosters cannot launch this spacecraft. It's too heavy to be launched. At least to Pluto, going to Jupiter and getting into orbit was one thing, but having the velocity to actually go to. Yeah, there's another question. Alan, you wanted to add? Yeah, I mean, there was repeatedly discussions again, like for example, with the original Staley proposal for Pluto fast flyby. Like, what was in the what was in the storehouse that we could use? I think it was a point, and they want to use an old Voyager antenna or something for fast flyby. So yeah, there's the reusing, but yeah. So you said there was five RTGs available in storage. Yeah. Yeah, so there's a last minute attempt to save the JPL program, which did not work.
Cool. Well, thank you very much. That was an incredibly
Thank you.
informative talk.
Appreciate the comments and questions.